was going to ask this next question. This one has a lot to do. You kind of answered some of it, but we see things obviously like the rebirth of Orthodox Christianity in Russia, the growth of all sorts of more traditional branches of Christianity in the U.S., while the more liberal mainline denominations, they decline and all that. But we also have recent events like the repeal of Roe versus Wade, like you said, the rise of Christian nationalism and like amongst the entire Trump electorate, really. But at the same time, we see like liberal states and urban cores, for better or for worse, maybe they'll vote out like a Chesa Boudin every once in a while, but they're just generally still they're like all of the other decline is just kind of cemented into there, and it's going in that direction. So in a kind of in almost not necessarily in a super political way, but in almost a more kind of symbolic, I think, Jonathan Peugeot kind of retraditionalizing that kind of way. Do you see like the entire world or the entire nation kind of experiencing some sort of religious revival at some point, or the already religious or religiously inclined demographics just experiencing that revival and further separating from the secular world?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. I think tipping point theory, which is a really interesting field to study, is rather applicable here. Edward Dutton, who you and I have talked about, gets into this in his study on the significance of religious demographics for a far more conservative future. So a tipping point is when a minority view suddenly becomes accepted among the masses. So there's a mass movement towards something that was until then, or until recently, a minority held belief or perspective or persuasion. And what scholars have noted, it's so fascinating. I've actually just was reading a tipping point study in the last week for some research. But what scholars have noticed, there's actually some very interesting group studies on this, where they'll put people into various groups, say like 10 different groups, and they'll all arrive at a consensus of some kind. The study I read is everybody was naming things. They had people were online, and it was several hundred people were involved in this. 10 different groups. They're all naming things, and then what the researchers did is they sent in people to kind of the rabble rouse, to disrupt. Say no, let's do it differently. And they found that anything under 20% of dedicated adherents for something different, okay, were frustrated. People shut them down. They weren't interested. But when they hit that golden 20%, I think another study had it at 25%, 25% dedicated adherence for a new paradigm, a different way of doing something. All of a sudden, they started to find that 50% plus started migrating to that position. So all you need is 20% of diehards to force a tipping point. And so that's really fascinating. You don't need 50% plus one. You just need 20%. 20% can change the world, as it were. And so, when it comes to something like Christian nationalism that we're talking about here, we're almost there. All the studies show we're almost there. The Brookings Institute just did I did a video on this a couple of weeks back, did a very detailed study, and they were shocked. You could go on YouTube and see the presentation. They gave a whole PowerPoint presentation in front of very horrified liberal scholars, but they found that 30% of the American population is already more or less Christian nationalists. Now, they're more supportive of the idea than diehards, like ready, full-blown Christian nationalists. But that's a very, very significant number. And then when you look at it from the vantage point of tipping point theory, and by the way, they define Christian nationalists, I think they had like a 5-point questionnaire. Do you believe America ought to be formally recognized as a Christian nation? Do you think Christian principles should govern the country? Kind of the typical, should Christians take dominion in every sphere of life? This kind of Christian nationalist sort of frames of reference. 30% of the population was relatively supportive of the idea. But in terms of tipping point theory, 10% were all in. 10% of the population are diehard Christian nationalists. So that really means we're more or less just one generation away when all said and done from reaching that 20% precondition for the masses to adopt this more nationalist populist paradigm. And then you bring demographics into that. Why do I say we're just a generation away? Well, because in the end, for every one child born to, say, a liberal atheist, 2 are born to a conservative Christian in our nation. I mean, the fertility discrepancy is literally that. It's a 2-to-1 between the irreligious and the religious. So it couldn't be more stark. And we also know, based on heritability scales, how much traits are inherited. We know that Jordan Peterson was just talking about this. Political persuasion and religious persuasion are largely inherited. And it's because it tends to come from our temperament. And our temperament is very genetically, shall we say, influenced. It's not determined, but it's certainly influenced. So on average, I think the heritability is around 0.4, 0.5. So if something is 1.0 heritable, it's 100% inherited. If something is 0.0 heritable, it's all social. There's no genetic element to it all. So what we found is religious sentiments, conservative or religious sentiments, political sentiments, do tend to be around 0.5 heritable, but that's also kind of misleading because, like, diabetes could be 0.5 heritable, but that's only because some groups have a 0.8 heritability and other groups have a 0.2. So it works itself out to, well, guess it's the same thing in religious and political sentiments. Guess who's got like the 0.85 heritability? The so-called far right. The more conservative, the more religious, the more you tend to pass that on to your children. Eric Kaufman of the University of London's found that. He's been tracking with the Amish on this. It's very fascinating. So for over the last 30 years, Amish go through Rumspringa, where teenage kids, 16, 17, they actually call it youth group. It's very funny, but because evangelicals have a very different concept of youth group. But for them, youth group is for their young people to go out, 17, 18 years old, and go out and experience the secular world and see if that's what you want. And about 30 years ago, 70% of them rejected it and said, no, I want to go back. I want to embrace the Ordnung and I want to become Amish. Today, the more woke the secular world becomes, today, 85% of Amish are retaining their Amishness into adulthood. So the numbers of conservative religionists keeping their kids in the faith has actually been going up. It's comparable among evangelicals, conservative Catholics, Orthodox, and the like. So there's some predictable element to this as well. That's what's so neat. So if we've got that kind of heritability of like 0.85 for the so-called far right, as it were, just basically conservative Christians, if that's the case, and if we have a 2-to-1 fertility discrepancy with secular liberals, I mean, you put tipping point theory together with the demographic disparity between conservatives and liberals, I think you're going to see a very, very decisive transformation in just another generation. Gang, make sure to click on that link below. Protect yourself from our current economic insanity with the timeless value of gold and silver. Patriots over the centuries, we have always relied on gold and silver to protect our assets during economic storms. And that's where the amazing patriots over at Goldco come in. If you've got $50,000 or more in an IRA, 401k, or savings account, you need to protect those assets from bumbling Biden's insanity with the timeless value of gold and silver. Click on that link below. Talk to our good friends over at Goldco. They want you to succeed so much, they're offering up to $10,000 in free silver if you open up an account with them. But this is a limited time offer, so don't wait. Click on that link below or visit my special website, turleytalkslikesgold.com.
Well, Steve and I saw some of this firsthand in Pennsylvania and Amish country. We were there together a few months back, which was, I enjoyed that experience, fond memories. But speaking of tipping points, this is, again, tough to make predictions about the future, but while America still maintains military supremacy worldwide, how do you see our, I guess, for lack of a better term, woke, diverse military faring on a long enough timeline, at least, against what I would say are the homogenous, more traditionally minded armed forces of a possibly united Russia, China, or general BRICS, or whatever perhaps might come in the next 10, 20 years about the world war situation? What are your kind of thoughts on that from the perspective we've been discussing?
Yeah, boy, and you're talking about Russia, China united. We don't with the upcoming trip of President Xi, Emperor Xi, as he probably should be called at this point, to Moscow in the next couple of weeks. We may be seeing it happening in the next month. For heaven's sakes, it's
Mhm.
astonishing how fast things are moving. It's a great question because ironically, I think I'm a bit hopeful with this in the sense that I'm hoping that the traditionalist bent of Russia and China so obviously end up demonstrating themselves superior to our woke military that it ends up shaming and in effect refuting the wokeness, right? You know, when you have the world's militaries laughing at you for what they see as moral and societal weakness. And that's the best scenario, right? The laughter. At worst, they're pointing out the cultural rot as that which inspires them to stand up against you. You know, something like Iran does, for example. Um, all of that, whether they're laughing or whether they're mobilizing, that does not make things easier on our part militarily. So just kind of to sum it up, I mean, the more traditionalist the world's various military capabilities become, hopefully, the more the states will feel the pressure to follow suit. So I am hopeful on that end. But if we know, if as President Trump said, to use the King James version, everything woke turns to dung. It will happen to our military as well. We'll always be strong. We'll always be powerful. We'll always have the nuclear capability. We will not always have the respect of the rest of the world, and we already don't. We already don't. I mean, even now, Russia's. I just did my first video today. Russia's telling the United States, "You better stand down on your support for Ukraine, or else there's going to be horrific consequences as a result of that." China has already told us to stick it in our ears when we said that China better not be providing lethal aid, as they call it, to Russia while we're arming Kiev to the teeth. That's exactly what the Chinese spokesperson said. Who are you to dictate to the world, DC, how we are going to conduct our business when you feel perfectly free to prolong this conflict, escalate this conflict? We will handle it the way we believe is best in Chinese interests. So, and India, of course, is doing the same thing. So, the days of the United States being able to tell the rest of the world what they can do they're over. My fear is that we've got a bunch of dolts in DC who don't see that, and they still think there's a unipolar world out there where they can dictate to the world and escalate things with impunity. And that's the scary part.
Well, and we're also arming Taiwan to the teeth that
Oh
China
my,
obviously knows about. So if they see the U.S. telling them don't do this in Russia, well, they arm Kiev to the teeth. Then,
exactly,
well, we're also arming like what you internationally recognize as our territory. You're arming separatists there to the teeth. So,
exactly.
and I would encourage people listening. The U.S. may kick up some of the rah rah stuff once they want to go to war with Russia or China. Don't enlist for that reason, or don't fall for the siren song of globalism, as Trump has said. Even if they
Right.
maybe tone down a little bit of the wokeness to make you think that it's for a good cause or whatever. There's much better military. Trust me, if the military now cared about fighting military endeavors overseas, we'd already be in Mexico. So I think
Right.
I think don't get shipped off to the Black Sea, please. Anyone listening?
That's
But
for sure. And just even to follow up there, I mean, and you'll generally hear, this is about freedom. This is about democracy, versus totalitarianism and authoritarianism. I mean, woke Democrats are literally saying this. It's
mhm,
so bizarre. But what people have to understand, I mean, that's Cold War language. I mean, that's literally 20th century language that's being applied to an entirely different geopolitical situation. We are now, that was, I get it. I get if we're in a bipolar world where there's two major modernist options vying for global dominance. I get it. If it's capitalism versus communism, fine. Freedom versus tyranny, fine. I get it. We're going into a multipolar world. You can't superimpose an either or in a multiplicable a multi can I do this? A multiplying factor of political outworkings. I mean, there's just no way you can do it. There's going to be authoritarian trends. There's going to be democratic trends. There's going to be totalitarian trends. There's going to be all kinds of democracies. There isn't just one. You've got liberal democracy, redemptive democracy. You got Orban's Christian democracy, and Poland as well. You've got all kinds of things. I mean, so this whole notion that we can take a bipolar paradigm and superimpose it on a multipolar world is insane.